This is U.S. history. In case you forgot what class you were in, this is the first video of week 6. So hopefully you turned in your week 5 packet. That would have included a couple assignments, a couple homework assignments from chapter 22, one quiz, and the chapter 22 test. Now we are on chapter 23. We started that last week, and we're dealing with the Cold War. Last thing you wrote down was the year of shocks. 1949 was a very important year in the sense that a lot of bad things happened. The communists took over China. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. Things couldn't get any worse for the free world. And then we start another war. So we're at number 6. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. After World War II, Korea was divided into 2 separate countries. If you look at page 531, it shows you a map that is similar to the map that you see on the screen here. Korea had been under Japanese control before and during World War II. After World War II, Korea was divided into 2 countries, a communist North Korea and a free South Korea. They were divided at the 38th parallel of latitude. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Instead of going to Congress for an official declaration of war, Truman went to the United Nations. The UN agreed to the use of force to stop North Korea. 14 nations sent troops, but the U.S. contributed the most. Because the U.S. sent in the most number of troops, they were able to choose the commander-in-chief of this operation. They chose Douglas MacArthur, the famed hero of World War II. He was placed in charge of the UN military forces. That's worth noting. Quickly, it was discovered that this war proved to be a stalemate situation. At first, North Korea swept through the south, nearly taking the whole peninsula. If you're still looking at page 531, you can see the farthest advance of North Korean forces, September 1950. They almost had the whole peninsula. MacArthur launched an ingenious amphibious assault at the port city of Incheon, halfway up the peninsula, which was behind enemy lines, and cut the North's offensive in half. By the end of 1950, MacArthur's offensive had nearly captured the entire peninsula for the South. You can see, again on the map, the farthest advance of UN forces, November 1950. Communist China, however, intervened, sending thousands of troops across the border and pushed the overextended UN forces back. Turn in your books, please, to page 532, and please read the box entitled Frozen Chosen. Read that box to yourself. Once you have finished reading, please unpause the video, and we will continue. Fighting continued back and forth. Trenches were dug, and a stalemate occurred with neither side taking the advantage. MacArthur admitted that Chinese involvement had made the conflict an entirely new war, but he also believed that the solution was to expand the war by invading China. MacArthur said, "There is no substitute for victory." And make sure you understand that's an important thing to think about. MacArthur believed that victory was the most important aspect of a war. Truman had other ideas. Truman's response was to promote what was called a limited war. Definition of a limited war: it's a war with a limited objective short of total victory. Truman's limited goal was freedom for South Korea. MacArthur wanted total victory, the defeat of North Korea, and, if possible, the defeat of Communist China. Truman believed that by invading China, it would be a booby trap, and it could possibly start a new world war. Possibly the Soviets would get involved in this conflict. In fact, the conflict between Truman and MacArthur grew so great that when MacArthur publicly criticized the president's actions in this war, Truman relieved MacArthur of command. Public opinion supported MacArthur over Truman during this time. After all, MacArthur was a war hero. Truman was just president by default. MacArthur gave a speech to Congress in which he was interrupted over 50 times with applause. If you look at page 533, there is another box entitled MacArthur's Speech to Congress. Please read that box to yourself. Once you have finished, please unpause the video and we will continue. Whether you agree with MacArthur's view of the war or Truman's view of the war, the fact of the matter was Truman had the final say. And the result was a truce, a demilitarized zone. After 2 more years of bloody stalemate, a truce was decided. Over 1 million people died in the fight, including about 54,000 American soldiers. The boundary was located near to where the original boundary had been, as you can see from the 2 maps there. The North was still communist, the South was still free. That's probably worth noting so you know the end result. North Korea would still be communist, South Korea would still be free. In 1952, because of the unpopularity of the Korean War, Truman decided not to run again. Although the president would be replaced, the goal to contain communism would continue. However, peaceful coexistence was also added to foreign policy. There's no reason why this point is on the next slide. It's just simply right underneath it. So if you're following along, maybe writing it right here would be fine. But peaceful coexistence, rather than trying to pursue total victory over communism, here's the definition of peaceful coexistence. The goal was to achieve some sort of agreeable accommodation. Well, President Truman is out of office. Joseph Stalin had died during this time period, and it began to look like the U.S. and the USSR could at least live with the other around. Before it was containment, stop the advance of communism. Now it's, let's let each side just exist. Number 7, Indochina. Indochina was an area in Southeast Asia that had been a colony of France. During World War II, Japan took over. After the war, when France tried to regain control, communist forces used anti-French sentiment to gain support from the people. 1954, Ho Chi Minh and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader in Indochina. That's what you need to know about him. He used guerrilla warfare tactics to gain control of part of Indochina. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which is always a fun name to say, resulted in a communist victory over French forces. That's what you need to know about that battle. The U.S. did not participate at this time, but had been sending economic aid for France. Well, end result of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, communists would live in North Vietnam, and then there would be a free South Vietnam. I think we've heard something like this before in Korea. Yeah, same song, second verse. After France's defeat and independence, and keeping with Cold War tradition, the region became countries. 2 of them were North Vietnam, controlled by communism, and South Vietnam, which was free. The man who would be in charge of South Vietnam was a man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. He became the president of South Vietnam, and that's worth noting. Ho Chi Minh, of course, would be the leader of North Vietnam. The U.S. was willing to allow communism to exist in North Vietnam, but sought to prevent its spread into South Vietnam. Peaceful coexistence. Actually, there was a theory, the Domino Theory. You guys ever played dominoes before? Not the actual game dominoes, but you set up the domino pieces in a nice line, and then you tip over the first one to see all the rest of the dominoes fall. The idea with the Domino Theory was this: if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, then others would fall as well. Fear was if South Vietnam fell to communism, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, all of these countries would eventually fall as well. As President Eisenhower said, you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is a certainty that it will go over very quickly. During this time in the 1950s and early 1960s, U.S. gradual military buildup will take place in South Vietnam. The U.S. will no longer just be sending financial aid, but now they're going to be sending military advisors into South Vietnam to kind of help train the troops up there. But as the U.S. continues to put in more support, we're going to see increased violence as well. Eisenhower will send over 2,000 military advisors to help DM train and organize his forces during the 1950s. Under President Kennedy, the number rose to 16,000 advisors, but the situation did not improve. In 1963, a coup resulted in DM's overthrow and murder, and the communists' guerrilla warfare became more common in South Vietnam. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War would become the Cold War's hottest conflict. Number 8, Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over. Growing up, he wasn't a fan of education, but he loved playing baseball. Theory goes is that the reason why he decided to take over Cuba was because he couldn't make it into the major leagues. Whether that's true or not is debatable. But in college, he got into politics, supporting socialist movements in opposition to the corrupt dictators in Cuba. Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Batista. He created a communist government, the first in the Western Hemisphere, just 90 miles from the U.S. So Castro takes over Cuba and establishes communism there. The U.S. responded by cutting all political and economic ties with Cuba and even supported attempts to overthrow Castro. In 1961, we have what was known as the Bay of Pigs operation. Cuban exiles, Cubans who had fled Cuba during this time, supported by the CIA, invaded Cuba. But it failed after 3 days of fighting. The U.S. refused to lend military aid to the conflict at the last minute, and an embarrassed John F. Kennedy said, "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." Another conflict that took place in Cuba was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because the U.S. refused to put more effort into liberating Cuba, the Soviets saw this as a sign of weakness. In an effort to strengthen their position in the Cold War, they attempted to install missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. In response, the U.S. ordered a blockade of Cuba with military force. This is probably the most dramatic moment in the Cold War in which it could have resulted in a nuclear war. You see the political cartoon right there. Both men arm wrestling for control. Both men sitting on hydrogen bombs. Both men have their other hand at the button ready to press it in case they feel like they're about to lose the arm wrestling. If I'm going to lose, I'm going to blow us both up, was the idea. A nuclear war was narrowly averted. The Soviets backed down. As Secretary of State Dean Rusk said about the close encounter, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." Most of the public identified this crisis as a clear-cut American victory. Few realized that Kennedy had made a deal not to invade Cuba, as well as to remove nuclear weapons that were stationed in Turkey. The move showed the U.S. was willing to accommodate the communists in the Western Hemisphere. Lastly, number 9, the Berlin Wall. As Cuba was an embarrassment to the U.S., West Berlin continued to be an embarrassment to the USSR. West Berlin was a showcase of democracy and had become a haven for refugees fleeing from East Germany, nearly 3 million people in 15 years. In 1961, the Soviets constructed the Berlin Wall to cut off West Berlin from the rest of East Germany. The wall was constructed to keep people from escaping communist East Berlin and entering free Western Berlin. If you look at so that's all the material that we're going to cover for today. For your homework, you guys have a quiz, pages 525 to 536 for a quiz. Also, activities book homework 137, 138. You only have to do 2 of the essays. Be good, do good.